Hello, A-Push. Welcome to period 3. I'm going to run down through the basics of what you need to know for this period. We are going to be beginning with 1754 and the French and Indian War, and going until 1800, which is historically known as the Revolution of 1800. It's really the election that brings Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans into office. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin with the 1754 and the French and Indian War. So this war is part of a larger war. Some actually call it the First World War in a lot of ways, or World War Zero, I've heard it referred to. But basically, it is a larger war that's happening all around the globe between England and France. And in what is now the United States, it is between the British and the colonists, who again are British and consider themselves British, versus the French and their native allies, their Native American allies. There are actually a couple tribes that do side with the British, specifically the Mohawks of the Haudenosaunee tribe, some others as well. But ultimately, most natives will ally with the French. And again, we talked about that with period 2 and the reasons for why the French tended to have better relationships with the French. So this war kind of goes on between 1754 and 1763, which is 9 years, although technically it's also called the 7 Years' War for some strange reason. But a couple things to know about this war. First of all, this war is won obviously by the British. Now, with that said, the British win a lot of the sort of tracts of land that used to be part of the French, sort of New France and the French Empire. This is up in Canada. This is through the Ohio River Valley, where some of the first sort of initial skirmishes happened. And they sort of are able to now control this land, but there's a couple issues that happen. First, while the British do win, war is very expensive, and now they are deeply, deeply in debt. So England is very broke. And because of that, you're going to start to see them wanting to recoup some of that money. It's also very expensive to then keep troops posted, British troops posted in the colonies. You have to pay for them, you have to feed them, etc., and to build forts to house them. And so all those things are very expensive. The other thing is that on the sort of heels of the Treaty of Paris that happens at the end of the war, there are some native tribes who rise up to push against these new British colonists who are pushing into their new territory, or what are now the British territories. And so you get someone like Pontiac, who is a sort of a spiritual a leader of the Ottawa tribe, I believe, who was inspired by a shaman named Neolin, who basically says that they need to sort of push out these new British intruders. And so this rebellion that kind of happens throughout the Ohio River Valley and up into sort of the Great Lakes convinces the British government that they need to really keep the fighting to a minimum, because this is going to lead to more troops and more money spent, and they don't have it. So this is where you see the first sort of erosion of what we used to see in period 2 as salutary neglect. And again, salutary neglect is the idea that that basically the British Empire is not going to enforce some of the rules and restrictions on trade, on particular political decisions, etc. That ultimately the British Empire is going to kind of let the colonies do their own thing, because what's good for them is good for Britain. And so because of that, though, the British colonists tend to feel pretty independent, pretty self-sufficient. And ultimately, 1763 is the moment where, because of the debt and the continued rebellions of the native peoples, we get the Royal Proclamation line of 1763. And this is a line, it's an invisible line, but is a line drawn basically down through the Allegheny Mountains and through the Appalachian Mountains to sort of set a pseudo-border boundary for the colonies, basically telling the colonists, hey, congratulations, we won this war against France, now don't go in that area because it's too expensive to patrol. And obviously the colonists reject this. They see this new line as hugely offensive. Why should you tell us where to go? This is land we rightfully won. And many of them ignore the line and go over it. And so the proclamation line is the first moment where salutary neglect is ignored. Or rather, salutary neglect is starting to erode, and the new restrictions are being ignored. Along with the proclamation line, the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Act of 1767. These are all new taxes, new restrictions on the colonists passed by Parliament and backed by the King. And these are all attempts by England to try to reassert some control over these colonists that, okay, now we have a problem with you, going and fighting these wars that we can't afford, and you need to pay your fair share of taxes, and if you're members of the British Empire, then you should be able to pay taxes like members of the British Empire. And so these are going to be slowly escalating all throughout the 1760s and the 1770s. And the colonists obviously are none too pleased about this, at least many of them. A lot of especially important sort of merchant class kind of, more powerful figures in the colonies. Specifically, we talk about actions like the Stamp Act Congress or the Stamp Act riots in response to that Stamp Act, which directly taxes American colonists. You have the Sons and Daughters of Liberty start to sort of join up to protest, to boycott British goods. Obviously, eventually, you have the Boston Tea Party in 1773. You have the Continental Congresses that start to form to try to sort of set new parameters for what can and can't be tolerated by the British government. So ultimately, keep those economic, social, and political impacts in mind when you're thinking about the AP test and how you can sort of create complexity in thinking about the reasons for revolution. Was it economic reasons? Was it political reasons? Was it social reasons? Was it probably an amalgamation of all of those things? So ultimately, this does lead to the first shots being fired in Lexington and Concord, and we have the Revolutionary War, right? And that begins in 1775, extends and kind of is happening up until 1783. Many of these leaders of those patriots, the colonists, who are fighting and who decide to start fighting, they're inspired by Enlightenment, the ideas of, John Locke and Rousseau. They're also sort of pushed toward sort of anger and frustration and revolution by writings like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which comes out in January of 1776. It's just this sort of continued escalation to rebellion, into revolution. Ultimately, the colonies win. You don't have to know every single battle. Lexington and Concord, the first couple battles important. Battle of Yorktown, maybe. Maybe some other ones as well, but they're not as important as the reasons for why the revolution happens, the sort of outcome, and the impacts. So colonies win, obviously. Here we are, United States. Couple reasons: home field advantage. We know the territory. We're not fighting. Generally speaking, the colonists are not fighting in classic British military lines and much more guerrilla-style warfare, which helps. We have generally good leadership. George Washington is a very solid general, to say the least. And we also have help, and specifically help from the French, who are still angry about the sort of French and Indian War and are all too happy to help us beat their rival, England. So that's a big piece of it and reason for our victory as well. The other thing is that this revolution influences a lot of other countries. There's revolutions that happen all throughout the world, specifically the French Revolution that happens in 1789, the many Latin American revolutions that are happening throughout the 1700s, as well as revolution in Haiti by the enslaved people who live there and against their sort of French masters. The other thing that obviously happens during this war, there's kind of two big things. Number one, obviously, is the Declaration of Independence, that once those first shots are fired, the Declaration of Independence is written and signed by members of that Second Continental Congress, which goes out on July the 2nd through the 4th in 1776. And that declaration is not the Constitution. Make sure that you know that the Declaration is about all men are created equal, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. This is the Declaration of Independence. It is not the ruling body of law that the Constitution is, right? So don't mix them up. The Constitution is very clearly not about all men are created equal, and sort of really sets the standard for what our government is going to be. The Declaration is much more about sort of what we are fighting for and why we are declaring our independence. So the other thing that happens during this war, of course, is that we do start to set up this new kind of makeshift government, and that government is under our first constitution called the Articles of Confederation. And this is sort of in action from 1781, when it's eventually ratified, until 1789, when the Constitution takes over for it, due to some of its weaknesses. Obviously, it really advocates a lot of state-supported governments. The states are what's most important, and that's a good thing for those who come from strong states like Virginia and Massachusetts, who are really for state power. They also create things like the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance of 1785, which kind of show the way to bring in new lands and how they become eventually states. That's going to help regulate that system. However, it's also very weak, because when you have a very weak central government, there's no judicial branch, there's no executive branch, it's only legislative. There's a president of the Congress, but that's not a president. And ultimately, it is very hard to pass any laws that can be enforced. You don't have an executive branch to execute those laws. So those laws can't be enforced. You can't raise taxes according to the Articles of Confederation, or at least it's up to the states to levy taxes, but it's impossible for a federal government to carry those out. Also, each state has the same exact single vote, which obviously is quite unequal in a lot of ways. And so many states who are bigger, like Virginia, don't love that idea that people in Rhode Island should be able to have the same vote as those in Virginia. So eventually this is going to lead to a particular fissure that shows that weakness, and that is Shays' rebellion. Daniel Shays is a Massachusetts farmer. He's a Revolutionary War veteran, doesn't get paid. Going into debt back in the day meant that generally you would go to jail, and you had all these veterans who hadn't been paid, couldn't pay their debts, were going to jail, and Shays and a bunch of his followers, called Shaysites, in 1786, 1787 in western Massachusetts, they will basically protest, and they protest by surrounding the courthouses, not allowing them to hold their trials in order to execute those local laws and bring them into justice. And so what happens is they protest, they surround the courts, they don't allow for those trials to happen, and this new federal government can't raise an army. They're not able to, because this new Articles of Confederation doesn't give them the powers to do so. Eventually, it's put down by the Massachusetts militia, but it really shows how this new government is far too weak. We're going to see that come back up, because when the Constitution is eventually ratified and brought in, they're going to be able to deal with a rebellion that's quite similar in a lot of ways. And so we'll see that in a minute. So the Constitution is eventually sort of written in secret in the summer of 1787, from May till, I believe, August. It's written in secret. Originally, its intentions were to sort of reform the Articles of Confederation, but ultimately they write this brand new document called the Constitution. That Constitution is full of compromises, some to know. Obviously about representation. We saw that with the Articles of Confederation, this idea that different sized states had different representation, but only had singular votes. This now is going to have a two-house legislation, that there is going to be one based on population and one just based on the states themselves, so the Senate and the House of Representatives. We have compromises about slavery. Specifically, we have the 3/5 compromise that gives representation, extra representation to those who own enslaved people. So very beneficial for the South. The Electoral College is in a lot of ways beneficial for southern states. They have more electors. So that's also kind of based on slavery. As well as just generally this new sort of system of separation of powers, that we now have 3 branches of government. They have checks and balances. that this new system of federalism and the federal government's place at the top, but then having sort of state governments underneath, and that the relationship between those two things is sort of important to balance each other out. This obviously then leads to this first political split, the ideologies of federalism and the Federalists, and then anti-federalists who aren't particularly an ideology, but just don't like the Constitution. They feel like it's far too much like the British government that they just fought to get out of. And so we have the Federalists who believe that the Constitution should be ratified, and we have the Federalist Papers that make that argument. They come from James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They're the sort of anonymous writers of those papers, arguing for the strong federal government and the Constitution to be ratified. And then you have the anti-federalists, people like Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, and so felt a little bit mad about it because he was off in France, along with the someone like George Mason, Patrick Henry. These are anti-federalists. They believe that the Articles of Confederation were just fine, and the idea of a new strong central government is scary. Ultimately, the Constitution is ratified because the anti-federalists argue appropriately and effectively for a Bill of Rights. And so that first 10 amendments of our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, those civil liberties that are protected. And so the Constitution is ratified in 1789. The Bill of Rights is ratified in 1791. And so ultimately we now have a new form of government. It replaces the Articles of Confederation. That rebellion that happens during Washington's first term is the Whiskey Rebellion. That Whiskey Rebellion is led by Pennsylvania farmers who do not want to pay this new tax that they're being taxed on their extra corn that's being turned into whiskey. They rebel. George Washington is able, with this new constitution, to raise an army of 15,000 troops. They ride together to Pennsylvania, and that rebellion disappears. They disintegrate, they leave, they don't fight, and ultimately this shows the new power of the central government sort of in the moment in 1792, 1793. So that's a good example of sort of how this new federal government is sort of shows its strength. And then finally, and we're going to see how this new sort of split ideologically with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is going to lead to more disagreements. First of all, we see that with Alexander Hamilton's financial plan for the country. So Hamilton is a Federalist, very important to remember that. He believes that a strong central government is deeply important. Specifically, he wants to do a couple things that I want to talk about. So first, he wants to assume all state debts. So all the debt from each state that they have accrued up to that point, the federal government is going to take it all, because let's let the states be happy. They'll give us their debt, and so that will lead to sort of the federal government being in charge of paying off that debt. Why is that good? Because debt is something that people are willing to sort of take a chance on, to like loan money to, because they're hoping that they'll pay it off and be successful. Why do you use a credit card to pay for things? Because the idea is that you are going into momentary debt that you will then pay off with interest when you have the money. And it's the same type of thing. So many European countries are going to be interested in helping us out because, hey, we're in debt, but if we do well, we'll pay you back with interest. So assumption of state debt, super important. We have these new taxes, the excise taxes, like I mentioned with the Whiskey Rebellion. Taxes where we're going to tax specific direct tax on goods that we see as being, accessible for taxation. We have very high tariffs. So these are taxes on foreign goods because we want people to buy United States goods. And then finally, and this is the most important part, I think, would be the national bank. We have a singular national bank that is going to be a strong sort of foundation for the American banking system. So while all these other little banks can exist, having a strong central bank where all the tax money is going in, where all those government bonds are being paid for, that's going to lead to a solid faith and interest in investment, which is going to lead to sort of a stronger foundation for our American economic system. These things are all deeply hated by people like Thomas Jefferson, Democratic Republicans, who felt like this was way too much power to be given to the central government, and how this idea that sort of states and individuals should lose their power to this new, scary, despotic, tyrannical federal government was going to be a problem. And ultimately, this also rears its head with a really famous law, or a couple laws, that are passed in 1798. And these are the Alien and Sedition Acts. And these laws do a couple things. First, they are passed by Federalists, John Adams and a very Federalist-heavy Congress. They are going to make it harder for immigrants to become citizens. They are going to allow the president to imprison or deport non-citizens. And they are also going to criminalize statements critical of this government. So who are they targeting? They are targeting anyone who is speaking out against Federalists. Obviously, this is Democratic Republicans. It's also, new immigrants, who many of them are French. They're fans of this new Democratic Republican idea, and so they are being targeted by this Federalist government. So because the Supreme Court doesn't have the powers yet to rule on what is or isn't constitutional, that's going to come in period 4, we have these famous Virginia and Kentucky resolutions written by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, sort of anonymously, where they basically resolve that these states are not going to follow these federal laws, that they reject these laws as constitutional. They say they are unconstitutional. Again, we don't have the Supreme Court yet to figure that out, so they are saying we're going to nullify these laws, we're not going to follow them. Why is that important? Well, because obviously nullification and the idea of not following a federal law by states is going to come up again and again and again, with especially the nullification crisis in South Carolina in the 1820s and 30s, and of course secession and the southern states seceding from the United States due to the ideas of the enforcement of slavery and such. And then finally, in terms of sort of foreign policy, it's important also to know that the United States, new country, we generally stay out of foreign affairs. We have the Proclamation of Neutrality, where we basically say England and France are still fighting, we're going to stay out of it. We have Jay's Treaty, where we make a treaty with England in 1794. Ultimately, George Washington leaves the presidency after 2 terms, which didn't have to happen, but he chose to get out of it. He never really wanted to be president. And ultimately, he gives that famous farewell address where he says, sectionalism is bad, political parties are bad, foreign alliances are bad. And we go 0 for 3. We do them all as soon as he's gone. But this address is very important in thinking about the sort of the precedent that is set by Washington and what he believes we should and should not do. And then finally, Adams becomes president in 1796. He sort of is almost led into war with France. There's a quasi-war happening off the coast. Ships are shooting at each other. Ultimately, we don't get into war with France, which Adams is very proud of. And in the election of 1800, which is a very contentious one, lots of name-calling, and, tensions are high. And ultimately, Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans win the presidency. They also win Congress, and so they get majorities. And in 1800, instead of Adams and the Federalists saying, no fair, this is our country, our government, we're gonna stay and fight you, they leave. They peacefully give up the White House and the congressional seats and the Senate seats. And this is called the Revolution of 1800 because of the lack of bloodshed, because the Federalists give up that political power to the Democratic Republicans. And because of that, we see this idea that, peaceful transfer of power can in fact happen without civil war. So that is the ending of the period, and we see the sort of beginning of this American identity, starting with the end of the French and Indian War, and sort of feeling ourselves as both British citizens but also independent of that, all the way to this new country in 1800 that not only has created a legitimate government, but also has been able to transfer power peacefully. So let me know if you have any questions. Obviously, comment if you must down underneath. But let me know, subscribe, pass it on to any APUSH kids you know and who need help in any school. But props to my TL kids. I will hopefully talk to you soon. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much, guys.